The major parties say they're cooking up a new direction for Indigenous affairs since the failed Voice referendum.
Would you like onion as well?
Yes, please.
But First Nations leaders in the policy space say it's all been served up before.
I despair about the most important Aboriginal policies receiving the attention that they ought to receive. At least a third of Indigenous Australians are the poorest of the poor. Policies are not fit for purpose.
Elections should be a contest of ideas, and I just don't see we're having that contest at the moment.
When I look at the two parties, it's difficult to see something substantive coming out that's going to make a real impact.
The starting point for both major parties is clear, with national recognition of Indigenous Australians off the table.
On the Voice, you won't legislate the Voice after losing the referendum?
No, we respect the decision.
Australians voted against being divided. A coalition government will start to provide additional support to those Indigenous Australians in a practical way.
As well as a Voice advisory body, the Uluru Statement from the Heart called for treaty and truth-telling in 2017.
When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish.
5 years later, a new government endorsed all three reforms.
On behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full.
Former Social Justice Commissioner Mick Gooder is disappointed the Prime Minister has walked away from that commitment.
Another broken promise. When it gets a bit tough, people walk away, and politically it makes sense because of the number of people voted no, but I think about how we go forward as communities, as societies, it's when the tough things happen.
He wants to remind government the country only voted on a voice, not treaty and truth.
If you're going to do something and maintain your commitment to the Uluru Statement, as you said on that night the Prime Minister won power, that we should engage in truth-telling. I think it's a really good way to start this process.
On the Indigenous Uluru Statement from the Heart, we had a crack. It wasn't successful.
I'm just going to take you. She asked if you were going to do the whole Uluru Statement.
Well, we've heard the statement from the Australian people is very clear. What we're concentrating on now is economic empowerment.
So Labor's plan for economic empowerment is a change in direction the federal government revealed earlier this year. It includes an $840 million investment for Indigenous people in the Northern Territory.
The economic piece is happening. There's a lot of great things happening in the economic space.
The government's latest Closing the Gap plan has a big focus on creating jobs.
Our new Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program will create 3,000 real jobs.
Remote jobs.
Good jobs.
1,000 new jobs.
Jobs that make a real difference.
Strengthening economic empowerment.
To the lives of individuals, their families and their communities.
I do hope that if the Albanese government wins power again, they continue with an economic development policy. It does secure jobs for local Indigenous people to stay on their land, look after their families and look after their natural assets.
Business owner and Liberal Party member Sean Gordon says creating 3,000 mostly entry-level jobs won't have the same impact as advancing Aboriginal staff already working in communities.
I see that right across the country when I'm going into community and working with the schools. Mostly Aboriginal workers within those schools are Aboriginal assistant teachers. You're not entitled to teacher housing. You're getting 50% of the salary that a non-Aboriginal teacher is getting. But those people have been Aboriginal assistant teachers for 20, 30 years. Why haven't we invested in developing those people up to be the teachers?
The government has also boosted its target of Commonwealth contracts going to Indigenous-owned businesses from 2.5% to 4% by 2030.
What we've got to be careful of is that the gap between the haves and the have-not is forever widening in the Indigenous affairs space. Those that have been able to benefit through the establishment of businesses and reaching into the opportunities are doing exceptionally well. But there is a large number of Aboriginal people that aren't doing so well.
This is all about changing the way that we purchase things.
Since the policy was introduced a decade ago under the Abbott government, $10 billion of Commonwealth contracts have gone to Indigenous-owned companies.
It's great to see Yolngu people who are determined to be economically independent.
A milestone celebrated by Labor. Professor Marcia Langton says those policy outcomes are encouraging.
In less than 10 years, the number of Indigenous businesses has doubled. And in the 2022 data reported by our Dylan Dewar Centre at the University of Melbourne, those businesses generated $16 billion.
While the Albanese government is focused on expanding policy, the opposition is promising a total rebuild.
Despite the fact that we spend billions of dollars in Indigenous affairs, nothing is changing to improve the lives of marginalised Indigenous Australians. So I have always said that I would want to conduct an audit.
The Coalition says it would conduct an audit of all government programs and expenditure in Indigenous affairs and reprioritise unnecessary funding towards frontline solutions. Sean Gordon agrees funding ought to be prioritised better, but says audits are an overreach.
If we know there's a failing, and if you think there's a failing, you don't need an audit to tell you that. You go away and make the improvements to ensure that we're going to get better outcomes.
As soon as you mention audit in all of our organisations, most people's minds will get, that's dog whistling. That's a little signal out there that people are hearing. You're not saying corruption, you're saying audit, but their minds go to corruption. You know, some of our big organisations, they're well run, they win governance awards.
We're not just looking at whether there's a level of corruption that exists, but we're looking at where outcomes are actually being provided to further provide investment in there.
The Coalition has also pledged to hold a royal commission into child sex abuse in Indigenous communities.
If we're elected, it will take place within the first 100 days that we come to government.
Mick Gooder ran the 2016 Royal Commission into Child Protection and Youth Detention.
Yesterday was the beginning of Child Protection Week around Australia. We take that as a signal that we're on solid ground as we start this inquiry.
Mick says a royal commission into sexual abuse in communities isn't the solution.
Concentrating on those negatives feeds into the psyche of Australians. I don't think it's going to achieve much.
With only 4 out of 19 closing the gap targets on track, real lives are at stake.
Mr Albanese, neither side of politics has been able to close these gaps. What's your plan now to fix this?
Neither side of politics has done well enough for First Nations people. That's just a fact.
In every discussion I've had in every expenditure review committee in government in opposition, a desire to invest as much money as is required to see those terrible outcomes improve, and it hasn't happened.
Only a stable government that bases its policy on good policy development and research will solve that problem.
These Indigenous leaders hope whichever party forms government will listen.
Rather than measuring Aboriginal people or Indigenous people against non-Indigenous people, I think we should be finding those pockets of success in the Indigenous community and then understanding why there are pockets of success. Why are people in one community living longer? Why are they healthier? Why are their kids going to school? I think if we can nail that, then I think we can address this issue of disparity